Captain Sarah Viper Rodriguez gripped the controls of her A-10 Thunderbolt II as enemy fire erupted around her aircraft. The desert landscape of Afghanistan stretched endlessly below, but her focus remained laser-sharp on the convoy of American soldiers pinned down by Taliban fighters in a rocky valley. The distinctive sound of her aircraft's Gyu-8 cannon had earned the A-10 its nickname, Warthog, and today that fearsome reputation would be put to the ultimate test. The radio crackled with desperate voices from the ground troops. "Viper, we've got heavy fire from the ridge line. Multiple casualties. We need close air support now." The urgency in the ground commander's voice sent adrenaline coursing through Sarah's veins. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but something about this call felt different, more desperate than usual. Sarah banked her aircraft hard to the right, scanning the terrain below for enemy positions. Her trained eyes quickly identified muzzle flashes coming from behind a cluster of rocks about 800 meters from the trapped convoy. The enemy had chosen their position well, using the natural cover to their advantage while maintaining clear lines of fire on the American forces below. "Ground team, this is Viper. I have visual on enemy positions, marking target with smoke. Danger close, keep your heads down." Sarah's voice remained calm and professional despite the chaos erupting around her. She had been trained for moments like this, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers on the ground. The A-10's massive cannon roared to life, sending a devastating stream of 30mm rounds into the enemy position. The sound was unlike anything else in military aviation. A deep, thunderous growl that struck fear into enemy forces across the battlefield. Dust and debris erupted from the ridgeline as the depleted uranium rounds found their targets with devastating accuracy. But the Taliban fighters were more determined than usual. Instead of retreating, they began focusing their fire on Sarah's aircraft. She could hear the metallic pings of small arms fire striking her plane's armored hull. The A-10 was designed to take punishment and keep flying. But today the enemy seemed to have more firepower than intelligence had suggested. A sudden explosion rocked the aircraft as a rocket-propelled grenade detonated near her left wing. Sarah fought to maintain control as warning lights began flashing across her instrument panel. The stick felt heavy in her hands, and she could feel the aircraft beginning to lose altitude. Smoke started seeping into the cockpit, bringing with it the acrid smell of burning electronics and hydraulic fluid. "Mayday, mayday. This is Viper. I've taken heavy damage and am losing altitude. Hydraulics failing. Multiple system warnings." Sarah's training took over as she began running through emergency procedures while simultaneously trying to maintain control of her crippled aircraft. The ground was getting closer with each passing second. The radio erupted with concerned voices from her support team. "Viper, can you make it back to base? What's your status?" But even as the question came through her headset, Sarah knew the answer. Her beloved Warthog was dying beneath her, its systems failing one by one as battle damage took its toll. She looked down at the convoy below, where American soldiers were still under heavy fire. The choice was clear in her mind even as her aircraft continued to lose altitude. There was no time to return to base, no time for a safe landing. Her mission was to protect those soldiers, and she would complete that mission regardless of the cost to herself. With grim determination, Sarah adjusted her heading toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters. If her Warthog was going down, she would make sure it went down fighting. The aircraft shuddered and groaned as she pushed it beyond its limits, coaxing every last bit of performance from the wounded machine. Below, the Taliban fighters had no idea that they were about to face the full fury of a pilot who had nothing left to lose. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was not supposed to crash that day. As Sarah fought to control her dying aircraft, she remembered the words of her instructor during flight training. "The Warthog can take a beating that would destroy any other plane and still bring you home." Today, that reputation would be tested beyond its limits as multiple systems continued to fail throughout the aircraft. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision across the controls, shutting down damaged systems and rerouting power to critical components. The hydraulic pressure was nearly gone, making every control input a monumental effort. Sweat dripped down her face despite the cool air rushing through a crack in the canopy where shrapnel had struck. The acrid smoke was getting thicker and she knew time was running out. "Ground team, this is Viper. My bird is badly damaged, but I'm going to make one more pass before I punch out." Clear the area around grid coordinates 41 SMD 112-345-67890. I'm coming in hot. Her voice carried a note of finality that made the ground commander's blood run cold. He knew what she was planning, and he knew there was nothing he could say to stop her. The enemy fighters below had no idea what was coming their way. They continued to pour fire into the American positions, confident that they had the upper hand after downing the close air support aircraft. Their celebration would be short-lived as Sarah lined up her damaged Warthog for one final devastating attack run. With her cannon almost empty and most systems failing, Sarah did something that would become legendary in military aviation circles. She pointed the nose of her 30,000-pound aircraft directly at the largest concentration of enemy fighters and pushed the throttles forward. The twin turbofan engines, though damaged, still had enough power to turn the A-10 into a massive kinetic weapon. The Taliban fighters looked up in horror as the smoking aircraft dove toward them at tremendous speed. Sarah held her course until the last possible second, delivering her remaining cannon rounds with devastating accuracy before pulling the ejection handles. The explosive charges fired, and her ejection seat rocketed her clear of the doomed aircraft just seconds before impact. The A-10 struck the enemy position with the force of a meteor, its full fuel load and remaining ordnance creating a massive explosion that echoed across the valley. The blast wave knocked enemy fighters from their positions and silenced their weapons permanently. Secondary explosions from hidden ammunition caches added to the destruction, creating a scene of devastation that would be remembered for years to come. Sarah's parachute deployed automatically, and she drifted toward the desert floor as the smoke and flames from her aircraft's final act of defiance rose into the sky behind her. The radio chatter was frantic as search and rescue helicopters were dispatched to her location. The ground troops, no longer under enemy fire, began moving to secure the area where she would land. As her boots touched the rocky ground, Sarah quickly gathered her parachute and began moving toward the rally point she had memorized during her mission briefing. The taste of smoke and dust filled her mouth and her ears were ringing from the explosion. But she was alive and relatively uninjured. Around her, the desert was eerily quiet after the thunderous violence of the past few minutes. The ground team reached her position within 20 minutes, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust as they raced across the desert terrain. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, the ground commander, was the first to reach her. His face showed a mixture of relief and admiration as he helped her into the armored vehicle. "Captain Rodriguez, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You saved all our lives today." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Around them, other soldiers nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same mixture of awe and gratitude. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a display of courage and skill that would become the stuff of legend. But Sarah's mind was already moving beyond the immediate aftermath of her dramatic ejection. She was thinking about the tail number of her destroyed aircraft, the unique identifier that would soon set in motion a series of events that would shock the fighter pilot community and reveal a secret that had been carefully guarded for years. 3 days after the crash, Major Tom "Thunder" Harrison was sitting in the briefing room at Bagram Airfield when the intelligence report landed on his desk. As an F-16 pilot with over 200 combat missions under his belt, Tom had seen his share of after-action reports, but something about this one made him pause. The tail number of the destroyed A-10 seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. Tom picked up his coffee and studied the report more carefully. The pilot, Captain Sarah Rodriguez, had been rescued successfully and was already being processed for a medal recommendation. Her actions had saved an entire ground team and eliminated a significant enemy threat, but it was that tail number that kept nagging at him, 80 or 248. He had seen those numbers before, somewhere in his past. The intelligence photos showed the twisted wreckage of the A-10 scattered across the rocky hillside. The impact had been so violent that the aircraft was barely recognizable, but investigators had managed to recover the tail section, with its identifying numbers still visible. As Tom stared at the photos, a memory began to surface, something from his childhood that seemed impossible. Later that evening, Tom called his father in Ohio. Retired Colonel James Harrison had flown A-10s during the Gulf War and had countless stories about his time in the cockpit of the mighty Warthog. What Tom was about to discover would challenge everything he thought he knew about military aircraft assignments and the connections that bind military families together across generations. Dad, I need to ask you something weird, Tom began, holding the intelligence report in his free hand. Do you remember the tail number of your A-10 from Desert Storm? I know it's been a lot of years, but I have this strange feeling about something. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Tom could hear his father rustling through papers. Funny you should ask, Colonel Harrison replied, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone. I kept a logbook from those days. Let me check. The sound of pages turning came through the phone, followed by another long pause. When his father spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming quieter and more serious. Son, the tail number was 800248. Why are you asking? Tom felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the intelligence report again. The same numbers stared back at him from the wreckage photos. Dad, that aircraft was just shot down in Afghanistan. A female pilot named Sarah Rodriguez was flying it when she saved a ground team. She ejected safely, but the plane was destroyed. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. That's impossible, his father finally said, though his voice carried uncertainty. That aircraft was retired years ago. I flew my last mission in it in 1991, and it was scheduled for depot maintenance. I always assumed it had been scrapped or put in storage. But as the two men talked, they began to realize that military aircraft often have longer lives than their pilots imagine, being rebuilt, refurbished, and returned to service multiple times over decades. The next day, Tom began making discreet inquiries about the aircraft's service history. What he discovered was a fascinating journey that spanned 3 decades and multiple conflicts. After the Gulf War, 80-0248 had indeed been sent to depot maintenance, where it underwent a complete rebuild. It had then been assigned to various units flying missions in Bosnia, Iraq, and finally Afghanistan. The aircraft had accumulated over 5,000 flight hours and had been flown by dozens of different pilots over its long career. Each pilot had trusted their life to this machine, and each had brought it home safely until that fateful day when Captain Rodriguez made her heroic sacrifice. The Warthog had finally given its life in service, just as it was designed to do. As Tom delved deeper into the aircraft's history, he began to understand something profound about the nature of military service. The same machine that had protected his father during the liberation of Kuwait had 30 years later been used by Captain Rodriguez to save American lives in Afghanistan. The aircraft had become a bridge between generations, a symbol of continuity in a world of constant change. Word of Tom's discovery began to spread quietly through the pilot community. Other F-16 pilots became curious about the connection, and soon the story was being discussed in ready rooms and officer clubs across the theater. The tale of the Warthog that served 2 generations of American warriors captured the imagination of pilots who understood the deep bonds between aviators and their aircraft. The revelation about tail number 800248 spread through the fighter pilot community like wildfire. Within a week, Tom Harrison found himself fielding calls from pilots stationed around the world, all wanting to hear the incredible story of the Warthog that had served 2 generations. The tale had taken on a life of its own, growing more remarkable with each telling as pilots added their own experiences and observations about the legendary aircraft. Captain Sarah Rodriguez was still recovering from her ejection when she received an unexpected visitor at the base medical facility. Tom Harrison had requested permission to meet the pilot who had flown his father's old aircraft on its final mission. As he walked into the small room where Sarah was reviewing her after-action report, Tom felt a strange mixture of emotions that he struggled to identify. Captain Rodriguez, I'm Major Tom Harrison, F-16 pilot with the 421st Fighter Squadron, he said, extending his hand. I wanted to personally thank you for what you did out there, and to tell you something remarkable about the aircraft you were flying. Sarah looked up from her paperwork, curious about this unexpected visit from a fighter pilot she had never met. Tom sat down and began telling Sarah the story of how her A-10's tail number had caught his attention. As he spoke about his father's service in Desert Storm and the incredible coincidence of the aircraft assignments, Sarah's eyes widened with amazement. She had always felt a special connection to her Warthog, but she had never imagined it carried such a rich history of service and sacrifice. Your father flew that same aircraft? Sarah asked, her voice filled with wonder. The same machine that saved those soldiers last week protected your father 30 years ago in Iraq? The parallel seemed too remarkable to be mere coincidence, as if the aircraft had been destined to serve heroically across multiple generations of conflicts. Tom nodded and pulled out a photograph his father had sent him. The image showed a younger Colonel Harrison standing beside 80-0248 after a successful mission over Kuwait. The aircraft looked pristine in the photo, its gray paint scheme unmarked by battle damage, its nose art still fresh and vibrant. It was almost impossible to reconcile this image with the twisted wreckage scattered across the Afghan hillside. "My father wants to meet you," Tom continued. "He's been following the story of your mission, and he says he feels like he owes you a debt of gratitude. In his words, you gave his old bird the warrior's death it deserved." The emotion in Tom's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself deeply moved by the connection between past and present, between father and son, between one pilot's service and another's sacrifice. The story began to attract attention from military historians and aviation enthusiasts who were fascinated by the aircraft's long service record. Research revealed that 80-0248 had been one of the most reliable aircraft in the A-10 fleet, with an exceptionally low maintenance rate and an unblemished safety record. It had never suffered a major accident or required emergency repairs until that final mission over Afghanistan. As more details emerged about the aircraft's service history, an even more remarkable pattern began to appear. Every pilot who had flown 80-0248 in combat had returned safely. The aircraft had been hit by enemy fire on multiple occasions, had suffered various degrees of battle damage, but had always brought its pilot home. Sarah was the first pilot to eject from the aircraft, and even then, she had survived without serious injury. The maintenance crews who had worked on the aircraft over the years began sharing their own stories. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez, no relation to Sarah despite the shared name, had supervised the aircraft's rebuild after Desert Storm. He remembered it as an exceptional machine that seemed to respond better to repairs than other aircraft in the fleet. That bird had personality, he recalled. It seemed to know its job and took pride in doing it well. Word of the story eventually reached the Pentagon, where senior officers began taking notice of the remarkable coincidence. The idea that one aircraft could serve so faithfully across 3 decades of conflict seemed to embody everything the military valued about duty, honor, and service. Plans began to form for a special recognition ceremony that would honor both the aircraft's service record and the pilots who had flown it. Sarah found herself at the center of a story much larger than her individual act of heroism. The tale of 80-0248 had become a symbol of continuity and dedication that resonated with military personnel across all branches of service. Requests began pouring in for interviews and appearances as the story captured the imagination of people far beyond the military community. 2 weeks after the crash, Colonel James Harrison arrived at Bagram Airfield for what the military had designated as a special recognition ceremony. The retired pilot had traveled halfway around the world to meet the woman who had flown his old aircraft on its final mission. As his transport aircraft touched down on the Afghan runway, James felt emotions he hadn't experienced since his own combat days decades earlier. Sarah was waiting on the tarmac when the transport arrived, accompanied by Tom and several other officers who had become part of the growing legend surrounding tail number 80-0248. As the older man descended from the aircraft, she could see the family resemblance between father and son, but more than that, she could see the bearing of a combat veteran who understood the weight of what had happened. The meeting between James and Sarah was electric with emotion and mutual respect. As they shook hands, James looked directly into her eyes and said, "Thank you for giving my old friend the honorable end it deserved. That aircraft served faithfully for 30 years, and you made sure its final act was one of heroism." Sarah found herself struggling for words as the full weight of the aircraft's history settled over her. The ceremony itself was unlike anything the base had seen before. Military personnel from multiple branches of service gathered to honor not just Sarah's heroic actions, but the remarkable service record of the aircraft itself. A memorial had been constructed using pieces of wreckage recovered from the crash site, creating a lasting tribute to both the machine and its final pilot. General Patricia Morrison, the theater commander, spoke about the significance of the story that had captivated the entire military community. In an age of high-tech warfare and computer-controlled systems, the story of 80-0248 reminds us that machines are still just tools in the hands of brave men and women who choose to serve their country, she said. her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. During the ceremony, James Harrison presented Sarah with something that left everyone in attendance speechless. He had brought with him the original flight helmet he had worn while flying 80-0248 during Desert Storm. The helmet bore the scars of combat, with scratches from shrapnel and faded squadron patches that told the story of its service. "I want you to have this," he said. "It belongs with the pilot who honored our bird's memory." Sarah accepted the helmet with trembling hands, understanding that she was receiving more than just a piece of equipment. She was being welcomed into a brotherhood of pilots who had trusted their lives to the same machine, who had felt the same vibration of its engines and the same responsive touch of its controls. The helmet represented a connection that transcended time and individual service records. The story of 80-0248 had begun to attract international attention as well. Military historians from around the world were studying the aircraft's service record as an example of how individual machines can embody the spirit of military service. The fact that one aircraft had served with distinction, through multiple conflicts and technological generations, made it a unique case. Study in military aviation history. Aviation magazines were preparing feature articles about the Warthog that wouldn't quit, and documentary filmmakers had already begun reaching out to interview the various pilots and maintenance personnel who had worked with the aircraft over its long career. The story was resonating with people who had never served in the military, but who recognized the themes of duty, sacrifice, and continuity that it represented. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah, Tom, and James stood together looking at the memorial constructed from pieces of the aircraft. Each piece of twisted metal represented not just the end of one machine's service, but the continuation of a tradition of courage that would inspire future generations of military aviators. The wreckage had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful, just as Sarah's sacrifice had been transformed into legend. The three pilots spent the evening sharing stories about flying, about combat, and about the unique bond that exists between aviators and their aircraft. James regaled them with tales of Desert Storm, while Tom shared his experiences flying F-16s in the current conflict. Sarah found herself part of a conversation that spanned generations, united by their common experience of trusting their lives to machines designed for war. As the Afghan sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, the three pilots stood in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about service, sacrifice, and the remarkable chain of events that had brought them together. Tomorrow, James would begin his journey home to Ohio, but the connections forged that day would last a lifetime. 6 months after the ceremony at Bagram Airfield, the story of 80-0248 had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Sarah Rodriguez found herself back in the United States, assigned to a training command where she was helping to prepare the next generation of A-10 pilots. The experience of her final mission continued to inform her instruction, as she shared hard-earned lessons about combat, flying, and the importance of never giving up on the mission. The documentary about the Warthog's service had premiered on the Military Channel to record-breaking viewership. Titled The Bird That Wouldn't Quit, it featured interviews with Sarah, both Harrison men, and numerous other personnel who had worked with 80-0248 throughout its career. The film captured not just the technical aspects of the aircraft's service, but the emotional connections between pilots and the machines they trusted with their lives. At the Air Force Academy, 80-0248's story had become part of the core curriculum for officer candidates. The tale was used to illustrate principles of courage, sacrifice, and the continuity of military service across generations. Cadets were required to write essays analyzing the ethical dimensions of Sarah's decision to sacrifice her aircraft to save the ground troops, and the responses showed a deep understanding of military values. Tom Harrison had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was now serving as an instructor pilot at the Air Force's premier fighter school. He had incorporated his family's connection to 80-0248 into his teaching methodology, using the story to help young pilots understand the weight of their responsibilities and the traditions they were joining. His students were captivated by the tale of the aircraft that served 3 decades and 3 wars. James Harrison had become something of a celebrity in veteran circles, speaking at reunions and military events about his experiences with 80-0248. At 72 years old, he brought a unique perspective to the story, having seen how military aviation had evolved from his early days flying the Warthog to the high-tech systems his son now operated. His speeches always emphasized the human element that remained constant despite technological advances. The wreckage memorial at Bagram had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for pilots passing through the base. Many left small tokens of respect, challenge coins, or unit patches as tributes to both the aircraft and Captain Rodriguez's heroism. The memorial had grown organically, with contributions from personnel representing dozens of different units and nationalities serving in Afghanistan. Sarah received hundreds of letters from people around the world who had been inspired by her story. Many came from military families who saw in her actions a reflection of their own experiences with service and sacrifice. Others came from civilians who were moved by the tale of courage under fire and the connections that bind people across time and distance. She tried to answer as many as possible, though the volume was overwhelming. The story had also attracted the attention of aviation museums, several of which were competing to acquire pieces of 80-248's wreckage for permanent display. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum had expressed particular interest in creating an exhibit that would tell the complete story of the aircraft's service from Desert Storm to Afghanistan. The exhibit would include not just physical artifacts, but interactive displays allowing visitors to experience the story from multiple perspectives. Publishing houses were courting Sarah to write a book about her experiences, but she remained focused on her current assignment training new pilots. She felt that her most important contribution was ensuring that future aviators understood both the technical and ethical dimensions of combat flying. The lessons learned from 80-248's final mission were too important to be confined to entertainment. Media, the ground troops who had been saved by Sarah's heroic action had remained in contact with her, sending regular updates about their lives and families. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen had been promoted and was now serving as a training instructor himself, passing on lessons learned from that day in the Afghan Valley. The men and women whose lives had been saved by 80-248's final mission served as living reminders of why the story mattered. Aircraft manufacturer Fairchild Republic, though no longer in business, had been contacted by aviation enthusiasts seeking to create a memorial to all A-10s lost in combat. The company's former engineers and designers were thrilled to learn about 80-248's remarkable service record, noting that the aircraft had performed exactly as designed, protecting its pilots and completing its missions even under the most adverse conditions. As the first anniversary of the crash approached, plans were being made for a larger commemoration that would bring together representatives from all phases of 80-248's service life. The event would serve not just as a memorial to one aircraft, but as a celebration of the entire community of people who had contributed to its 3 decades of faithful service. 1 year after the crash, the National Museum of the United States Air Force hosted the most remarkable reunion in military aviation history. Representatives from every phase of 80-248's service life had gathered to dedicate a permanent exhibit honoring the aircraft and the people who had made its long service possible. The gathering included pilots, maintenance crews, weapons specialists, and even some of the factory workers who had originally assembled the aircraft in the early 1980s. Sarah Rodriguez stood before the completed exhibit, wearing the flight helmet that James Harrison had given her at Bagram. The display included actual pieces of wreckage from 80-248, photographs spanning its entire service life, and interactive stations where visitors could experience flight simulators based on some of the aircraft's most famous missions. The centerpiece was a detailed timeline showing how one machine had served through multiple conflicts and technological generations. The exhibit's opening ceremony drew military personnel from around the world, along with families of the pilots and crews who had worked with 80-248 over the years. General Morrison, now retired, served as the keynote speaker, reflecting on how the story had captured the imagination of people far beyond the military community. "This aircraft represents the best of military service," she said. "Not just the heroism of individual moments, but the quiet dedication of decades of faithful service." James Harrison, now 73, sat in the front row with his son Tom and daughter-in-law Lisa, who had become an integral part of the extended family that had grown around 80-248's story. 3 generations were represented, from James's World War II veteran father-in-law to Tom and Lisa's young daughter, who had been named Sarah in honor of the pilot who had become like family to them. The technical analysis of Heisenblau-48's service record had revealed remarkable statistics that surprised even experienced maintenance personnel. The aircraft had accumulated more flight hours than 95% of all A-10s ever built, had suffered battle damage on 14 separate occasions, and had never once failed to complete a mission due to mechanical problems. Its reliability rating was among the highest ever recorded for any combat aircraft. During the ceremony, Sarah announced her decision to donate the flight helmet James Harrison had given her to the museum's collection. "This helmet represents more than just one pilot's service," she explained. "It symbolizes the connection between all the brave men and women who have trusted their lives to machines like 80-0248. It belongs here, where it can inspire future generations to understand the weight of military service." The reunion had attracted international attention, with delegations from allied nations whose pilots had served alongside American forces in various conflicts. British Royal Air Force pilots who had worked with A-10s during joint operations shared their own stories of the aircraft's reliability and effectiveness. The gathering had become a celebration of international cooperation and shared military values. One of the most moving moments of the ceremony came when Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the maintainer who had supervised 80-0248's post-Desert Storm rebuild, presented Sarah with the aircraft's original maintenance logbook. The thick volume contained handwritten entries from dozens of maintenance crews spanning 3 decades, a detailed record of every repair, upgrade, and inspection the aircraft had received throughout its service life. The story had also inspired changes in military policy regarding aircraft heritage and historical preservation. The Air Force had announced new procedures for tracking and preserving the service records of aircraft with significant historical value, ensuring that future generations would have access to complete documentation of their military aviation heritage. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself standing alone with the memorial display, surrounded by pieces of the aircraft that had become such an important part of her life. The twisted metal fragments had been carefully arranged to create an artistic representation of the Warthog in flight, frozen in a moment of graceful power that captured the essence of what the A-10 represented to those who flew and maintained it. The crowd began to disperse, but many lingered to share their own stories and connections to military aviation. The reunion had created new friendships and strengthened existing bonds within the military community. Children who had heard the story were asking their parents about military service, inspired by the tale of courage and dedication that 80-0248 represented. As Sarah walked through the museum's halls, she reflected on how one moment of crisis had led to such an extraordinary chain of events. The decision to sacrifice her aircraft to save the ground troops had seemed straightforward at the time, driven by training and instinct rather than any consideration of historical significance. Yet that single act had revealed connections and meanings that none of them could have imagined. The story of 80-0248 had become more than just military history. It had become a testament to the enduring values that connect people across generations and circumstances. In an age of rapid technological change and shifting global dynamics, the tale provided a reminder that some things remain constant: courage, duty, sacrifice, and the bonds that form between people who serve together in dangerous places far from home.